And joining us now in the studio is my colleague, Paul Ndiho, and you have part 2 for us on the failed state index and the countries in Africa that fall into that category.
That's correct, Ndimiake. As we mentioned in part 1 of our failed states report yesterday, the Fund for Peace, a Washington-based non-profit organization and foreign policy magazine, says 7 of the world's top 10 failing states are in Africa. Let's now take a look at 4 countries on the list: Zimbabwe, Ivory Coast, Uganda, and Nigeria. Zimbabwe took the 6th position on the failed states index. The Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, beat Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF at the polls in 2008. But when the president refused to step down, neighboring South Africa had to broker a deal for both parties to share power. But the coalition government is failing. The MDC has been effectively sidelined and President Robert Mugabe continues to wield power. Political analyst Nii Akwete says it's not surprising that so many African countries are dubbed as failed states.
African countries are basically the youngest countries in the world. They emerged out of colonialism. The state wasn't set up well. And then Africa became independent right in the middle of the Cold War, with the East-West rivalry impinging on what African countries could do. The Congo is a perfect example, with the murder of Lumumba and the imposition of Mobutu in place of the leader that the country elected, Patrice Lumumba.
Ivory Coast ranked number 10 on the list of failed states. Before this year's post-election violence, Ivory Coast was an economic success story, often referred to as the gateway to West Africa. Last year, the country went to the polls to elect a new president. The winner, Alassane Ouattara, secured a victory by a tiny margin. The incumbent, Laurent Gbagbo, refused to step down. A 4-month showdown ensued. Ouattara was finally installed in office almost half a year later. Observers say it may take months for Ivory Coast to get back where it was even a year ago. J.J. Messner, senior associate at the Fund for Peace, dismisses claims that the report is biased towards Africa and says that many African countries scored poorly on the index because of democratic pressures, uneven economic development, abuse of human rights, and the rule of law.
So it's not exclusively African countries, but I think that is recognition in many ways that there are immense pressures among many of the countries in Africa, whether it be political pressures or economic pressures or social pressures. It may even be natural disasters, which really undermine the state's ability to function properly and also undermine society writ large.
In Uganda, protesters flooded the streets after February's presidential elections, which predictably gave Uganda's longtime leader Yoweri Museveni another victory. Government troops responded to the peaceful demonstrators with brutality, smashing car windows with guns and pointing weapons at people, reminding Ugandans of the previous brutal regimes. Mr. Akwete blames the West for encouraging and supporting such failing states.
For that reason, I think it is egregious that the U.S. so frequently gets into bed with dictators. And the failed states that we are talking about, I'm saying when you look at the top 5, of which 4 are African countries, the thing that jumps out at you is that all 4 used to have dictators who had been befriended by the U.S. because they were thought of as friendly tyrants. So it goes to my argument that friendly tyrants are no good for their countries, and I also think they are not even good for the United States.
Nigeria is also on the failed states index in the 14th position. In April 2011, Nigerians voted in elections which were declared by the international community as the most credible in the country's history. But after the incumbent, President Goodluck Jonathan, had been declared winner in the poll, the main opposition rejected the results, and violent demonstrations broke out in the north of the country, leaving more than 800 people dead. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest oil producers and gets about 90% of its revenues from oil. Another symptom of its failure as a state, analysts point to the poverty in which so many of the country's 150 million citizens live.
Paul, thank you so much for that excellent two-part series. Now, obviously, many are curious. There are 177 countries on this list. Of the top 20 worst, 15 of them are from Africa. Give us some good news. Are there any that are doing well, that are closer to the 177 mark, which is the coveted mark?
Absolutely, Ndimiake, there is hope against hope. Some countries have done very well. When you look at a country like South Africa, a country like Ghana and Botswana. Botswana, by the way, is considered as the beacon of hope for Africa. But when you look at the list of the failed states index, it ranks number 3 on that list. So there is hope against hope.
And you're saying the case of Botswana, it's always credited for its economic growth, but not always, it's not always doing very well politically.
Absolutely. There are a lot of political pressures. When you look at, there's technically no opposition in Botswana. So when you look at those pressures, there's people are being stifled. They can't speak out. So I think that's why it performed the way it did.
What about the countries that rank 177, between 150, between 177?
Well, most of those countries are the Scandinavian countries, followed by European countries. Unfortunately, none of the African countries were able to hit the lower marks. But some of them are promising. Like I said yesterday, some of these countries have improved dramatically when you look at how they've been performing over the last 4 years or 5 years. So this is not to say that they are doing worse, but some of them have shown some significant improvements in one way or another.
Well, thank you so much, Paul Ndiho.
A pleasure being on your show, Ndimiake.
Thank you. Likewise. Pleasure having you with us.